My daughter stood by while her husband called me an extra mouth to feed and gave me 1 week to leave. They didn't know I had a secret. 3 months later, a letter arrived at their apartment, informing them the rent was tripling. It was signed by the building's new anonymous owner, me. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments, and hit like and subscribe if you believe a father's love is a foundation, not a doormat. The small plastic bear's voice box had come loose again. Lily's favorite toy. I sat at the small desk in the hallway, the tiny screwdriver feeling clumsy in my 62-year-old hands, carefully tightening the casing. The hallway was quiet, a little dim, a forgotten river running through the center of their lives. From the bright open-plan kitchen, their voices carried sharp and clear. "We simply can't afford to keep subsidizing him," David said. My son-in-law. His tone had that clean, impatient polish he used on conference calls, the sound of a man who saw life as a series of quarterly reports. "We need to optimize our living space, Jess. It's about our future, our bottom line. Your dad, he's an extra mouth to feed." The screwdriver paused an inch from the screw. My breath caught in my chest. An extra mouth. The words were not shouted. They were stated like a fact from a spreadsheet, a line item to be cut. "David." Please, Jessica's voice was a thin, frayed thread. "My daughter, he helps with Lily. He fixes things around the apartment. He's 62, not the super." David countered, his voice losing none of its crisp certainty. "I've already found a place. A senior apartment complex out past the interstate. It's practical. He has 1 week to get his things together." 1 week. The bear's stitched-on smile seemed to mock me. I had just finished resewing it last night, sitting under this same dim light. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just listened to the silence that followed the one where my daughter chose her husband's future over her father's presence. Her silence was the only answer I needed. I slowly turned the final screw, hearing the faint click as it settled into place. I set the bear down on the desk, its plastic eyes staring blankly ahead. Then, without a word, I stood up and walked the few steps to my room, the converted storage space by the laundry, and quietly closed the door. The sound of their lives, the clink of ice in a glass, the murmur of the television faded behind the cheap, hollow wood. Failure didn't have a sound, but in that moment it had a room, and I was in it. I began packing that same afternoon. There wasn't much to pack. My life had been condensed into 2 worn suitcases and a handful of cardboard boxes years ago. The room they had given me was really just a large closet off the laundry room. It had no window, only a vent that carried the constant damp smell of detergent and the rhythmic hum of the dryer. I folded my shirts, the ones with frayed collars I kept meaning to replace, and laid them gently in the suitcase. My hands moved with the slow, practiced rhythm of a man who had built things his whole life. Now I was dismantling one. My fingers brushed against a small silver frame at the bottom of a drawer. I pulled it out. It was Clara, my Clara taken on our last anniversary. We were standing in the backyard of our old house, the one on Maple Street. The sun was setting behind her, catching the silver in her hair. Her smile wasn't for the camera. It was for me. A wave of memory, sharp and sudden, washed over me. I remembered sitting at that same kitchen table on Maple Street 2 years ago. Jessica and David sat across from us, their faces bright with rehearsed earnestness. They held brochures for a beautiful apartment building downtown, the Oak Haven. They had the ambition, they said, but not the down payment. It was the only thing holding them back from the life they deserved. Clara, her hand resting on mine, had looked at me with that expression that could undo any argument I ever had. "It's just a house, Sam," she'd said, her voice soft. "Jessica is our home." So I signed the papers. A lifetime of work, of overtime, shifts, and careful savings of fixing leaky roofs in the rain, all condensed into a single banker's check. I handed it to my daughter. Jessica had thrown her arms around me, her cheek wet against mine. "You'll always have a home with us, Dad," she'd promised. "Always. We'll take care of you." I stared at the photograph now in this windowless room that smelled of bleach. The memory of her promise was a bitter taste in my mouth. A home with them. An extra mouth to feed. A soft knock on the door pulled me back. The door opened a crack and Lily's small face peeked in. "Grandpa," she whispered, her eyes wide. She stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her, as if she were entering a secret place. She was holding a folded piece of construction paper. "I made you something," she said, her voice barely audible. She held it out to me with both hands. I unfolded it. It was a crayon drawing of 5 stick figures under a bright yellow sun. A man, a woman, a smaller boy, and a girl. And in the very center, holding the girl's hand, was a figure drawn taller than all the rest. Me. Underneath, in shaky 10-year-old letters, she had written, "So you don't forget us." I couldn't speak. I just looked at the drawing, at the simple, undeniable truth of a child's love. This was what they were taking from me. Not a room, not a roof over my head. They were trying to take this, my place in the center. I carefully folded the paper and tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat, right over my heart. "I won't forget, kiddo," finally managed to say, my voice thick. "You make sure you don't forget either." She nodded, a single solemn dip of her chin, then she hugged my legs, her small arms wrapping around me with a strength that belied her size. Then she was gone, slipping out the door as quietly as she came in. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after she left, the warmth of her hug still on my legs. They thought they were just getting rid of a burden. They didn't understand. They were getting rid of the only man who would ever love that little girl without a spreadsheet. And in that moment, the grief in my chest hardened into something else. Something cold and clear and heavy as steel. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. They had forgotten who I was. I would have to remind them. The day I moved was cold and gray, the sky a flat, unforgiving slate. David was on an important work call in his home office, the door firmly shut. Jessica busied herself in the kitchen, wiping down a counter that was already clean, her movements quick and brittle. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just nodded toward the front door and said the taxi was waiting. No hug, no "call us when you get there." Just the quiet, efficient removal of a problem. The apartment at Golden Years Villas was as bleak as its name was cheerful. A single room with a stained carpet, a flickering fluorescent light in the kitchenette, and a window that looked out onto a soot-stained brick wall. The air hung thick with the smell of pine sol and quiet despair. I set my 2 old suitcases down in the middle of the floor, the sound echoing in the empty space. This, I thought, as I surveyed the 4 pale walls of my new life, is what the end of a promise looks like. For a week, I just existed. I unpacked my few clothes. I put Clara's picture on the nightstand. I sat and watched the brick wall, feeling the full weight of my 62 years. Then one evening, while sorting through a box of old papers I hadn't touched since Clara passed, my fingers brushed against a thick manila envelope. The return address was for Innovate Dynamics, the small tech company where I'd worked as a machinist 30 years ago. I almost threw it away. It was probably just old tax forms, another piece of a life that no longer mattered. But something made me pause. I remembered the project, a specialized gear component I had designed. I remembered the handful of stock they'd given me, a token gesture I had filed away and forgotten. My fingers, stiff with age, fumbled with the seal. The letterhead inside was different, heavier. It wasn't from Innovate Dynamics. It was from AeroCorp Industries, a global aerospace and defense contractor. "Dear Mr. Miller," it began. "Pursuant to the recent acquisition of Innovate Dynamics, we are writing to inform you of the status of your vested shares." I scanned the formal corporate language, my eyes catching on a series of numbers that made no sense. I read the sentence again, and then a third time. In the dead quiet of that sad little room, the world tilted. The numbers on the page seemed to glow a string of impossible zeros. It was a typo, a cruel joke. It had to be. For a long time I just sat there, the letter resting on my knees. The cheap fluorescent light in the kitchenette hummed a monotonous sound that seemed to mock the impossible numbers on the page. Millions. The word had no meaning in this room. It was a foreign currency, a language for a life I had never lived. My first thought was that it was a scam, a cruel, elaborate trick designed for lonely old men in sad apartments. My hand, shaking slightly, reached for my phone. There was only one person who could tell me if I was losing my mind. George picked up on the second ring, his voice the same gruff, no-nonsense sound it had been for 40 years. "What's wrong?" he said. "Not hello, just a question." That was George, a retired accountant who saw the world as a ledger that either balanced or didn't. "George, it's Sam," I said, my own voice sounding distant. "I've got a piece of paper here that doesn't make any sense." I read him the letter, my voice flat, expecting him to find the flaw, the loophole, the fine print that would make it all go away. He was silent for a long time. "Innovate Dynamics," he finally said. "I remember you talking about them, back when we still had hair." He paused. "Sam read me the QSIP number on the stock certificate they mention." Slowly. I read the string of letters and numbers. He grunted. "Okay, let me make some calls. Don't go anywhere. And for God's sake, don't sign anything." The line went dead. I spent the next 2 hours staring at the brick wall outside my window. I watched the afternoon light fade, turning the grimy red brick to a dull, bruised purple. I thought of Clara. I thought of the simple retirement we had planned. A small cabin by a lake, maybe. Fishing in the mornings. Reading on the porch. A life measured in seasons, not stock prices. This letter, this impossible fortune, felt like an insult to that quiet dream. It had arrived 20 years too late to a man with no one left to share it with. The phone rang at 5:17 p.m. The sound was so loud in the quiet room it made me jump. It was George. His voice was different. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a kind of breathless awe. "Sam," he said. "Are you sitting down?" I am. Hoan answered, my knuckles white on the edge of the table. "I've been on the phone with AeroCorp's investor relations and a broker I've known for years. It's real, Sam. All of it. The acquisition went through last quarter. Your old shares were converted. After taxes. Sam, you're looking at just over $9 million. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the picture of Clara on my nightstand. $9 million. The number was an obscenity. It was a joke told by a cruel God. All those years I'd scrimped and saved, all the overtime shifts, the worn-out boots, the meals I'd skipped so Jessica could have the best. And now this. A mountain of money I had never asked for, arriving in a room where love had died. When I finally hung up the phone, I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel relief. I felt a profound, chilling cold spread through my chest. This money wasn't a blessing. It was a tool. It was a weapon. I thought of David's smug face, of Jessica's silent betrayal. I thought of the phrase, "an extra mouth to feed." The world had seen me as a small, quiet man, a liability to be managed. They had no idea the kind of leverage I was now holding. The money hadn't come to make my life comfortable. It had come to make things balanced. It had come to fund a correction. I slept that night in the cold, quiet room, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a workshop after the tools have been laid out, just before the real work begins. The next morning, George called before I had finished my first cup of coffee. The awe was gone from his voice, replaced by the sharp, practical tone of an accountant who smells a liability. "Sam, we need a plan," he said, getting straight to it. "This kind of money doesn't stay quiet for long. It has a sound, and your daughter and her husband have excellent hearing when it comes to the sound of a cash register. They'll come sniffing around playing the part of the loving, concerned family. You need to be ready. What do I do, George? I asked, looking at the brick wall that had been my only view for a week. You don't need a friend right now, Sam. You need a surgeon, he said. Her name is Evelyn Reed. She's the best estate lawyer in the city. She doesn't send sympathy cards, but she knows how to build a wall so high they'll run out of ladders trying to climb it. I'll make the call. Evelyn Reed's office was on the 30th floor of a glass and steel tower downtown. The view from her waiting room wasn't of trees or lakes. It was a commanding view of the entire city, a landscape of power and capital laid out like a map. Her office was minimalist and immaculate. No family photos, just sharp angles, a dark wood desk, and the quiet hum of a city at work. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that didn't waste time on pleasantries. Mr. Miller, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. George filled me in on the basics, a significant and complicated change in your circumstances. I sat down, and for the first time, I told the whole story to a stranger. I told her about Clara. I told her about selling our home. I told her about Jessica's promise. I told her about the little room by the laundry and the final brutal sentence from David. I spoke without emotion, laying out the facts, like a machinist laying out blueprints. She listened without a single interruption, her pen still. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. And what is your objective, Mr. Miller? Asset protection, a new will, a trust for your granddaughter. All of that, I said, my voice steady. But I have a more specific acquisition in mind. I slid a piece of paper across her polished desk. On it, I had written a single address. The Oak Haven. She picked it up, a single perfectly sculpted eyebrow rising. You want to buy your daughter's apartment building? I do, I said. For the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't professional calm appeared in her eyes. It looked like appreciation. All right, she said, her voice taking on a new energy. Here's how we do it. We form a limited liability company, an LLC. It will be the legal owner of your assets, including the new funds. We'll use a registered agent in Delaware to make the ownership opaque. The company will need a name. I had already thought of it. It was the only name that made sense. Clara Properties, I said. She wrote it down, a small, respectful nod. Clara Properties it is. We will transfer your assets into the LLC's accounts immediately. You will be the sole silent member. All transactions will be handled through this office. When we make an offer on the building, it will come from a third-party investment group that we control. Your name will appear nowhere. Once the purchase is complete, we will transfer management to another third-party company. They will handle all communication with the tenants. You will be a ghost, an anonymous, invisible landlord. I leaned back in the chair. The plan was clean. It was precise. It was a machine. How long will it take? I asked. Evelyn smiled, a thin, sharp smile that was all business. The money is already a compelling argument, Mr. Miller. The right offer can make things move very, very quickly. I stood up to leave, feeling lighter than I had in years. I was no longer a victim. I was a plan in motion. I left Evelyn Reed's office and walked back out into a city that looked the same but felt different. The pieces of my life were no longer scattered. They were being assembled into something new, something with walls. I spent the next few days in the quiet efficiency of paperwork, opening new accounts under the LLC's name, signing documents Nora sent by courier, moving the money in clean, untraceable lines. For the first time in 2 years, I felt like a machinist again, calibrating a complex piece of equipment where every gear had a purpose. The bleakness of the small apartment didn't change, but my relationship to it did. It was no longer a final destination. It was a workshop. The call came on a Tuesday evening. I saw Jessica's name on the screen and felt a calm settle over me. It was the first test. I let it ring twice before answering. Dad. Her voice was unnaturally bright, the kind of cheerfulness people use when they're about to ask for a favor. I was just thinking about you, wondering how you're settling in over there. I'm managing Jessica, I said, keeping my own voice level. That's great. That's so great, she said, rushing her words. Listen, David and I were talking. We've been so stressed lately and we were thinking we really need a break. There's this wellness retreat in Arizona. It would be so good for us to just reconnect. But with everything going on, it's just a little out of reach right now. She let the sentence hang in the air, a baited hook. A year ago, I would have jumped at it, relieved to be offered a way to be useful. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between us with the weight of a stone. There was a long moment of dead air. I could hear her breath catch. What? What did you say? I said no, Jessica. I repeated, my voice unchanged. My finances are no longer available for your retreats. She sputtered. But, Dad, it's for our well-being. I thought you cared. I care very much, I said, which is why I think it's time you and David learned how to fund your own well-being. She was silent for another few seconds, and then the line went dead. She had hung up on me. I set the phone down on the table. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of a boundary being drawn, of a lock clicking into place. I had said no, and the world had not ended. A moment later, my other phone buzzed. The new one Evelyn had given me, the one with only 2 numbers saved in it. Hers and George's. It was Evelyn. Sam, she said, her voice crisp. Something has just come across my desk. An opportunity. You might find it interesting. What is it? I asked, turning to look at the brick wall outside my window. The Oakhaven, she said. The apartment building on the west side. The current owner is a partnership that's dissolving. They're looking for a quiet, fast, all-cash buyer to avoid a public listing. They want it done by the end of the month. I looked at the brick wall, but I wasn't seeing it anymore. I was seeing my daughter's shocked, angry face. I was seeing my son-in-law's casual cruelty. I was seeing the blueprint of a machine I was building, and the final, most important piece had just been handed to me. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign. Evelyn Reed did not move with sentiment. She moved with the clean, surgical precision of a woman who understood that the quickest way between 2 points is an all-cash offer with no contingencies. The day after our meeting, an offer was made on the Oakhaven. It didn't come from Clara Properties. It came from a blandly named investment group based out of a corporate suite in Chicago. A third party whose only job was to exist on paper and sign checks. The sellers, a dissolving partnership of 2 brothers who hadn't spoken in a decade, were delighted. They had been preparing for a long, messy public listing. Instead, they were handed a clean, fast exit. Due diligence was a formality. The building was solid. The books were clean. Within 2 weeks, we were in escrow. I spent those weeks in my small gray apartment, a ghost in my own life, reviewing documents that Nora Evelyn's assistant sent by courier. I signed papers on my small, wobbly kitchen table, the legal weight of the documents a stark contrast to the lightness of my surroundings. I was a millionaire, living in a room that smelled like old carpet, quietly orchestrating the biggest correction of my life. I felt a grim satisfaction in the irony of it. The closing happened on a Tuesday, an event I did not attend. Evelyn handled it. The wire transfer was made, the deed was recorded, and just like that, Clara Properties became the owner of the 3-story brick building where my daughter and her husband slept completely unaware. They believed I was 2 miles away, a forgotten old man staring at a brick wall. They had no idea I was now their landlord. The first letter arrived on a Friday. It was a simple professional notice printed on the letterhead of the new management company, another layer of anonymity. I could picture the scene perfectly. Jessica would have collected the mail, flipping through catalogs and bills. She would see the plain white envelope, open it with mild curiosity. "Oh, looks like the building was sold," she would say, tossing the letter onto the granite countertop in the kitchen I had paid for. "Some new management company, Oak Haven Residential Services." David would glance up from his laptop, annoyed at the interruption. "As long as they don't mess with the parking." I couldn't care less, he would reply, his attention already back on his spreadsheets, and that would be it. The letter, the first tremor of the earthquake that was about to shatter their world, would be dismissed as junk mail. They were so focused on the money they thought I had, they never once considered the power I was quietly acquiring. They saw me as the target. They had no idea I was the hunter, and that the trap had just been set. I let 2 weeks pass. 2 weeks of silence from my end. 2 weeks for them to settle into their new reality, a reality where I was no longer a factor. I imagined their relief, the freedom they must have felt. They had successfully optimized me out of their lives. I spent my days in the quiet routine of my small apartment, walking to the library, reading old paperback novels, and drinking coffee that tasted like patience. On the 15th day, Evelyn sent a single encrypted email. "The second notice has been delivered." I didn't need to see the letter. I had approved the draft myself. It was a masterpiece of corporate politeness, a document that could deliver a devastating blow while sounding like a weather report. It spoke of rising operational costs, property tax reassessments, and the necessity of bringing all units to the current market rate. For most of the tenants in the Oak Haven, this meant a modest, manageable increase. But for Unit 3B, the one my life savings had paid for, the adjustment was different. For them, the rent was tripling. I waited. I knew the call would come, but I knew it wouldn't come from them. They wouldn't give me the satisfaction. It came at 6 o'clock that evening. The phone buzzed and Lily's name lit up the screen. I answered on the first ring. "Grandpa." Her voice was a small, frightened whisper. "Are you there?" "It's bad." "I'm here, kiddo," I said, my own voice calm and steady. "What's wrong? Mom and Dad are fighting," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Really bad. We got this letter. It says the rent is going up. A lot. Like triple. I've never seen Dad this angry." I could hear muffled shouting in the background, David's voice tight with fury. "What's he saying?" I asked gently. He's yelling about the new owners," Lily whispered. "He's pacing around the kitchen. He called the landlord a soulless corporate ghoul and a predatory vulture fund that's trying to bleed honest families dry. He said, 'How are we supposed to afford this? This is a disaster.' Mom is crying. A soulless corporate ghoul. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. He was railing against a phantom, a faceless enemy, never once suspecting the ghoul was a 62-year-old man in a sad apartment 2 miles away, a man he had called an extra mouth to feed. "It's okay, Lily," I said, keeping my voice soft. "This is grown-up stuff. It's not your problem to solve. Are you in your room?" "Yes." "With the door closed?" "Good. You stay there. Read a book. This will pass." I could hear her take a shaky breath. "Okay, Grandpa. I love you." "I love you too, kiddo," I said. And the line went quiet. I sat there in the silence of my own apartment for a long time. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a grim, cold satisfaction. The plan was working. I wasn't just taking their money. I was holding up a mirror. I was making them swallow the same bitter medicine they had tried to force down my throat. They were finally feeling the cold panic of having their security ripped out from under them by a faceless, indifferent power. And the most perfect part of it all was that they were horrified by the reflection, without ever realizing they were staring at their own faces. For a man who had just been handed a financial death sentence, David was surprisingly resilient. His initial shock and fury didn't curdle into despair. Instead, It transformed into something else, something I recognized from his days selling software. It became a righteous crusade. He wasn't just a tenant facing a rent hike. He was a leader, a hero. I learned this, as I learned most things now, through the quiet, worried voice of my granddaughter. Lily called me 2 days later, whispering from her bedroom. "He made flyers, Grandpa," she said. "He printed them at the library. They have big angry letters at the top. It says Oak Haven Tenants United and Stop Corporate Greed. He's been going door to door all afternoon." I could picture it perfectly. David, with his confident salesman's smile, turning his personal problem into a community cause. He would be charming. He would be persuasive. He would speak of fairness and community words that had never seemed to apply to the old man he'd kicked out of his home. "What are the neighbors saying?" I asked, keeping my voice a low, steady rumble. "Some of them are scared," Lily said. "But a lot of them are angry too. They're listening to him. He's telling them that if we all stick together, we can force the new owners to back down. He's organizing a tenant meeting for Thursday night, in the common room." Of course he was. David didn't just want to solve his problem. He wanted an audience. He wanted a stage. Over the next few days, Lily became my unwilling correspondent, a small spy in a house that had forgotten how to tell the truth. She would call me on her way home from school, her voice hushed as she walked. "He's practicing a speech in the living room," she told me one afternoon. I could hear the faint sound of David's voice in the background, rising and falling with theatrical passion. He keeps saying things like, "We, the hard-working families of the Oak Haven, will not be silenced by some faceless corporation hiding in a boardroom." He sounds like he's in a movie, Grandpa. I imagined him there pacing on the expensive rug I'd helped them buy, performing for an invisible crowd. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He who had called me a subsidy to be cut was now painting himself as a warrior for the common man. "And your mother?" I asked. "She thinks he's amazing," Lily said, and for the first time I heard a note of teenage cynicism in her voice. "She keeps looking at him like he just saved a bus full of orphans. She told Mrs. Henderson next door that David has always been a fighter for justice." I stayed quiet on my end of the line, letting her talk. I was the ghost in their machine, the silent owner listening to the tenants plot a revolution against me. It was a strange, lonely kind of power. Every angry word David spoke, every cheer he got from a neighbor, was just another brick in the wall he was building around himself. A wall I knew he would never be able to climb. "The meeting is tomorrow night," Grandpa Lily said in her last call before the event. "Dad says he's going to demand that the owner, the head of Clara Properties, show up and face the people they're trying to destroy. He says he won't leave until they do." I stood in my small gray apartment, looking at the brick wall that had become so familiar. A cold, quiet smile touched my lips. "Don't you worry, kiddo," I said softly into the phone. "I'm sure the owner will be there. He wouldn't miss it for the world." The common room at the Oak Haven smelled of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. It was a room designed for forced community, a place of beige walls and mismatched donated furniture. Tonight, however, it was filled with a different kind of energy. Anxious, angry, and united. I stood in the hallway just outside the open door, a ghost at my own execution, listening. David was at the front of the room, standing behind a folding table he'd arranged like a podium. He was in his element. The lights caught the expensive watch on his wrist as he gestured, his voice ringing with a passion I had never heard him use for anything other than a sales pitch. "They think we're just numbers on a spreadsheet," he boomed, his voice resonating with rehearsed conviction. The crowd of about 30 tenants murmured in agreement. "They think they can hide behind their corporate name, Clara Properties, and bleed us dry. But we are not numbers, we are hard-working families, we are neighbors, we are a community." There was a smattering of applause. I saw Jessica in the front row, her face glowing with adoration. She looked at him like he was a general leading a revolution, not a man who had kicked her own father out into the cold. This soulless predatory fund thinks they can triple our rent without a fight. David continued, his voice rising. Well, they are about to find out what the Oak Haven is made of. We demand they fix the leaking pipes in the laundry room. We demand they repair the broken elevator. But most of all, we demand transparency. We demand that the owner of this company, whoever they are, show their face and answer to the people whose lives they are trying to destroy. The room erupted in applause, louder this time. People were on their feet. David held up his hands, a benevolent leader calming his flock. He was magnificent. He was a fraud. And his performance was my cue. I stepped through the doorway. I didn't stride in. I didn't make a grand entrance. I just walked my steps quiet on the worn linoleum. I moved along the side of the room, a simple old man, in a clean but unremarkable jacket. But my presence was a stone dropped into the smooth surface of his performance. A few people turned to look, their applause dying in their throats. David was mid-sentence talking about legal action when he saw me. He faltered. The practiced passion in his eyes flickered and was replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted annoyance. Dad. He said the word, a sharp, irritated question. What are you doing here? Jessica's adoring smile froze on her face. Her eyes widened, a flicker of panic in their depths. I didn't answer him. I just kept walking my path, slow and deliberate, until I reached the front of the room. I walked right up to the folding table and stood beside him. The room was utterly silent now. The only sound was the hum of the vending machine in the corner. I turned to the crowd, my gaze sweeping over their confused, curious faces. My son-in-law is right. I began, my voice calm and clear, needing no microphone. You do deserve transparency. I then turned to face David, who was staring at me as if I had just sprouted a second head. I placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Thank you for gathering everyone, David. You've made this much easier. Then I looked back at the tenants. My name is Samuel Miller, I said. My late wife's name was Clara, and I am the owner of Clara Properties. If silence had a sound, it would have been a thunderclap. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Then a collective gasp seemed to pass through the room. I watched the color drain from Jessica's face. She looked like she had seen a ghost. In a way, she had. The ghost of the man she thought she had successfully erased. David just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The confident general of a moment ago was gone, replaced by a stunned, speechless boy. I didn't give them time to recover. I turned my attention back to the tenants, my voice still calm. I understand your concerns about the rent increase, I said, and you are right to have them. This building has been neglected for years. The previous owners let things slide. The money from the rent adjustments is not for profit. It is for you. It is to fund the new elevator that is being installed next month. It is for the new plumbing system to fix the leaks and the low water pressure. It is for the roof repairs scheduled to begin this spring. I let that sink in. I saw a few people exchange surprised glances. Mrs. Henderson from 2AA, retired school teacher, nodded slowly. I also understand, I continued, that a sudden sharp increase is a hardship. That was never my intention for the long-term residents who make this place a community. I looked around the room, meeting their eyes. Therefore, for all current residents in good standing, the rent increase will be capped at a much more moderate phased-in rate over the next 12 months. My management company will be in touch with each of you individually to discuss the new terms. We want you to stay. A wave of relief washed over the room. The tension broke. People started whispering to each other, smiling. They were no longer a mob. They were just neighbors again. Then I turned back to the folding table. To my family. My voice dropped just slightly, but in the quiet room, every word was a bell. However, I said, looking directly at David. For Unit 3B, the market rate adjustment stands as delivered. Jessica made a small, strangled sound. David's face, which had been pale, was now flushing a dark, ugly red. "I've been running the numbers on my own budget recently, David." I said, my voice as neutral and clinical as his had been in my kitchen. "As a man in finance, I'm sure you'll appreciate the logic. After a careful review, I've decided it is simply not practical for my company to subsidize extra mouths to feed." I let his own words hang in the air between us. I watched him truly hear them for the first time, not as a clever insult, but as a verdict. I saw the public humiliation land a physical blow that made him stagger back a step. The hero of the people, the warrior for justice, had just been unmasked in a room full of his own recruits. The rebellion was over. The meeting dissolved not in anger, but in a quiet, awkward shuffle as people began to leave, careful not to make eye contact with the couple at the front of the room. Mrs. Henderson gave me a small, approving nod as she passed. David and Jessica didn't move. They just sat in the front row, two statues in an emptying room, the silence around them louder and more damning than any shouting could ever be. I had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a correction. A painful, necessary, and long overdue balancing of the books. I didn't go back to the Oak Haven that night. I didn't need to. The work I had set in motion would continue without me. I spent the evening in my small, quiet apartment, the brick wall outside my window, a familiar, comforting presence. I made a simple dinner of eggs and toast and sat at my table listening to the sounds of the building around me. The low murmur of a television next door, the rumble of the ancient elevator, the sound of a neighbor's key turning in a lock. These were the sounds of ordinary lives, lives that weren't a performance. The victory from the tenant meeting didn't taste sweet. It tasted like medicine. Bitter, necessary, and prescribed for an illness I had let fester for too long. There was no joy in seeing my daughter's face crumble in public, or watching the confident mask slide from my son-in-law's face, revealing the panicked boy underneath. There was only a grim sense of correction, of a great heavy thing being set back on its proper foundation. The knock on my door came the next afternoon. It wasn't the sharp, impatient rap of a delivery driver. It was a soft, hesitant sound, a question in itself. I opened the door to find Jessica standing there. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Her usual armor of perfect hair, flawless makeup, and expensive clothes was gone. She wore a simple gray sweatshirt, her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were red and swollen. She was holding a single wilting grocery store rose. She couldn't speak at first. She just stood there on my worn welcome mat, the terrible quiet of the hallway behind her. I stepped aside. "Come in, Jessica," I said, my voice softer than I intended. She walked in and stood in the middle of my small living room, looking around as if she had never seen a place so bare. She finally looked at me, and the composure she had held together for so long shattered. A sob broke from her, a raw, ugly sound of true grief. "Dad," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I never thought. Everyone was looking at us. David hasn't said a word since we got home. He just sits in his office staring at the wall." I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't. I just stood there and let her feel the full weight of the truth. I let her see what the world looks like when the performance ends and the applause stops. "We were wrong," she finally choked out, sinking into the room's only armchair. "It was him, his ideas, but I let it happen." I stood there and I let it happen. I sat down on the edge of the bed across from her. "The truth has a way of being uncomfortable, Jessica," I said, my voice gentle but firm. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "So what now? What do we do?" There it was. The question I had been preparing for. I leaned forward, my hands on my knees. "The 30-day notice to vacate is firm," I said. The words were not an attack. They were a statement of fact. This isn't a punishment, Jessica. It is a consequence. The arrangement we had is over. You and David need to build your own home now, not just live in one. Her face crumpled again. But Dad, we have nowhere to go. We can't afford that new rent, and with this, we have nothing. You have each other, I said. You're both smart. You're resourceful. 30 days is a long time to make a plan when you finally have to. I stood up and walked to the small kitchenette. I poured her a glass of water and handed it to her. Her hand was shaking as she took it. She was learning right there in my sad little room that some falls have no safety net, and sometimes a father's greatest act of love is to be the one who finally cuts it away. The final week of their 30 days arrived with a quiet, somber rhythm. I saw the moving truck parked outside the Oak Haven one afternoon, a smaller, less optimistic vehicle than the one that had brought them there. I didn't go over. I gave them the dignity of their own struggle. On the last day, Jessica called. Her voice was flat tired. The apartment is empty, Dad. We left the keys on the counter. There was a pause. Are you going to do a walkthrough? No, I said. The management company will handle that. I wanted there to be a clean line, a professional distance. Okay, she said the word small and empty. Well, goodbye, I guess. Jessica. Wait, I said before she could hang up. There's one last piece of business. It's about Lily. Could you and David meet me at my apartment? In an hour. They arrived looking worn down. The fight was gone out of them, replaced by the heavy fatigue of consequence. They sat on the two stiff chairs in my living area, a space that suddenly felt too small for the weight of our history. I didn't offer them coffee. I just sat across from them and placed a thin manila folder on the table between us. When this all started, I began my voice even. You both said your decisions were about providing for Lily's future. You said you needed to cut costs to streamline to save for her college education. David nodded slowly, not looking at me. Jessica just stared at her hands. I agreed that Lily's future was the most important thing, I continued. So I decided to help you with that. I slid the folder across the table. David opened it. Inside was a single document, the statement for a newly established 529 college savings plan. The beneficiary was listed as Lily Miller. The initial contribution was a substantial 5-figure sum. David's head shot up, his eyes wide with confusion. What? Where did this come from? I don't understand. I looked at both of them, my gaze steady. It came from you, I said quietly. That's the first year of your tripled rent payments for Unit 3B. I just went ahead and made the deposit on your behalf. Since you were both so concerned with saving for Lily's future, I wanted to make sure that money went exactly where it was supposed to. They were speechless. The color drained from Jessica's face. It was the perfect checkmate. They couldn't be angry. I had done a profoundly good thing for their daughter. They couldn't be grateful without admitting. The money was a consequence of their own greed. They were trapped by my precision. My actions were never about punishing you, I said, standing up. They were about correcting a balance. I needed to make sure Lily's future was a secure foundation, not just a line in an argument. Now it is. I walked to the door and held it open. The rest is up to you. They left without a word, the folder clutched in David's hand. As I closed the door, I felt a final quiet click. It wasn't the sound of victory. It was the sound of a debt being paid, a ledger being balanced. I had not been cruel, I had simply been accurate. And in that accuracy, I had found my peace. Months later, my penthouse sat quietly on the top floor of a building overlooking the city skyline. The space wasn't a display of wealth. It was a choice for peace. The walls were white, the furniture was simple, and the balcony was wide enough for a single chair, a pot of rosemary, and a man who no longer had to look over his shoulder. On the small table by the window, a postcard rested next to my morning coffee. It was from a smaller, more modest town, a place where rent didn't require the selling of one's soul. Jessica's handwriting filled the back with just 3 words: "We are trying." There were no long apologies, no excuses. Just a small, tired, and perhaps honest truth. And Lily called every Sunday, her voice as clear as a bell, telling me about school, about the new rescue dog they'd adopted, about everything except the things we no longer needed to say. I would stand on the balcony breathing in the clean city air and look down at the rush of life below. The bitterness in my chest, a familiar companion for so many years, was gone. In its place was a quiet stillness. I had reclaimed my dignity not by making them suffer, but by refusing to participate in their false story any longer. I had redefined what family love meant. It wasn't an endless bank account or a silent obligation. It had to be built on a foundation of respect, not exploitation. Love was a foundation, not a doormat. People might say I had won, but this feeling was more than victory. This was liberation. I hadn't just bought a building. I had bought back my own life. And in the quiet of the morning, with Lily's crayon drawing framed carefully on the wall, that was the only investment that truly mattered. This story is a powerful reminder that true love requires respect, not just a sense of duty. When kindness is mistaken for weakness, the greatest act of self-worth is to establish firm boundaries. Sometimes the only way for a family to heal is to first hold everyone accountable for their actions. What would you have done in Sam's situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video if you believe in standing up for yourself, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength and earned respect.